Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Making Room, Pre-Development Questions for Presbyterian Churches in New York City, co-hosted by the Presbytery of New York City and Partners for Faith-Based Affordable Housing and Community Development. I'm Kate Toth, Executive Director of Bricks and Mortals, which is a member of the partnership. I'll be serving as moderator today, and thank you all so much for joining us. Rhonda, I don't know if you want to bring up the PowerPoint now so we can see the agenda. I wanted to start off by letting you know that around half of all Presbyterian of New York congregations are registered for this event, a really impressive number, which also shows just how much interest there is in this topic. As the agenda shows, the event is 2 hours long and it'll be structured in 3 sections, which is with a short Q&A after each section. Please put your questions and any comments in the chat box. My colleague, Rondalee Davis, will masterfully handle those questions during each Q&A. Our first section is an introduction to opportunities and engagements with the Presbytery of New York City. Our panelists are the Reverend Dr. Robert Fultz Morrison. He is the Executive Presbyter of the Presbytery of New York City. The Presbytery has more than 11 language groups among its 90 congregations in the 5 boroughs and 11 worshiping communities. Reverend Fultz Morrison has served as a pastor in the Presbyteries of New York City, the Twin Cities area, Newark, and Albany, and as a Presbytery executive in Central New Jersey. Nathaniel H. Christian III is currently serving as chair and president of the Commission on Mission, Budget, and Corporate Responsibility on the Board of Trustees of the Presbytery of New York City. He's a member of the Eastchester Presbyterian Church in the Bronx, where he has served on the session and in many other capacities. Professionally, he's an attorney with over 30 years of Wall Street experience. He is also co-founder of Castle Oak Securities, one of the nation's leading African-American-owned investment banking firms. Finally, Roger Leaf is an elder of the First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York, where he has served as the president of the Board of Trustees, church treasurer, and chair of the Finance Committee. He currently serves on the Board of Trustees of the Presbytery of New York City, where he is chair of the Budget and Finance Committee and a member of the Investment and Audit Committees. He also serves on the Investment Committee of the Sailors Snug Harbor, one of the nation's oldest charitable foundations. He has written about and advised nonprofits on transportation and urban planning issues. Mr. Leaf is a retired Wall Street banker who over a 40-year career worked on acquisitions. Now I'd like to hand it over to Robert Fultz Morrison for an opening blessing.
You're on mute, Robert. Back on mute.
Can you hear me now? Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you all for coming on board with today's presentation, you and the Presbytery of New York City and the visitors that are with us. Thank you, Kate and Rondalee, for setting this up so we can do this presentation today. So first, let us begin with prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day and for all the days that you have made room in your life for us. You have shown us who is our neighbor that we are called to love as much as we love you and love ourselves. And so as we come into this time of this presentation, we ask that you use the resources of our very lives, the resources of our churches, so that we too can make room for our neighbors, the neighbors we're called to love in your name. We thank you for the example that Jesus has given us, and for this we pray in his name. Amen. So I'm going to go ahead and begin my presentation today, and I want to thank all of you again for being here. I want to begin by saying long before we had churches or European settlers in this area we now call the city of New York, the Lenape First Nations people lived in this very region. This region provided the Lenape with housing, with food, with places for social gatherings and play. More than 400 years later, people from many nations and regions of the world now occupy this same area, coming for a variety of reasons. And so, like those who first lived in this region, we also seek housing and food, places for employment, social gatherings, sports, the arts, as well as worship. Presbyterians who came first built worships in what's now Queens, New York, more than 350 years ago. Through subsequent centuries, Presbyterians built many more houses of worship, hospitals, schools, and residences for the needs of the people who lived in this city. Today, this is what we look like as the Presbytery of New York City. This is who we are. The New York City Presbytery has 90 churches housed in 87 buildings set aside for worship and ministry. A few of our churches and most of the 11 newer worshiping communities that we have share space in either the same building or meet in other facilities or even in a home. Now, Protestant congregations once dominated this city. In the past century, as immigration and demographic patterns changed and wages failed to keep up with the cost of living here, some of our congregations moved locations, merged with others, or closed, while other religious organizations built or rented storefronts in the same communities. I want to say that one consultant that has studied congregations stated that unless the leadership and the congregation find a way to remake or redevelop or rebirth themselves, the average lifespan of a congregation can be only 80 to 100 years. And here's a diagram showing that period of growth and thriving, sometimes followed by a period of declining and struggling unless there's redefinition, redevelopment, or rebirth. Now, I know many of our congregations today are stressed by the cost of maintaining buildings that once housed larger numbers of congregants. With human and financial resources diminished, choices are made whether to employ pastors, support ministries in our communities, or just pay for maintaining the building and insurance. With property as a real value in the city of New York, developers are watching you. They're eyeing opportunity to acquire city real estate. Now, developers may look promising, offering you a bucket full of money, but today's focus is to first begin with your own missional assessment. So let me ask you to consider these questions. What does it mean to be a church today in New York City? What relevance does your congregation have to the community in which you are located? How much church income goes into maintaining the building instead of mission engagement? Alice Mann, who's also another church consultant, identified 3 questions every congregation ought to answer for itself. Who is God? Who are we? Who is our neighbor? Let me say that developers, though, aren't the only ones interested in what you are doing with your property in your community. So are city planners, your neighbors, and entrepreneurial pastors and congregants pondering how can our church be relevant to meeting the spiritual, the physical, and the mental needs of persons in our communities. How can the very buildings that belong to us be used to make room for worship and meeting human needs for housing, food, artistic expression, as well as other social gatherings? I want to share with you some recent examples of what our Presbyterian churches in New York City have done to be relevant to their communities and to the mission that they believed God has called them into. This first slide is the French Evangelical Church, once located in the French Quarter of New York City in the Chelsea neighborhood. Over time, things changed, demographics changed, and the church that had a parish house next to it that once housed single women moving into New York has now become the location of a new market rate condominium development. In the course of that proposal, the developer also renovated the entirety of the church building and also gave them 3 floors in which they could use for their church purposes in exchange for the property that was next door. Another church went a different direction. The Jan Hus Church on the east side has a beautiful building that you all may have been in before, but eventually found that in today's society, the tens of thousands of persons who were coming to them to meet their needs, the building just didn't adequately suit all of their purposes. And so this small congregation, working carefully at pre-development and mission goals, decided to move to a new location. They sold their church to another church and bought a building on First Avenue, rebranded themselves as Avenue Church, New York City, and just this past December, cut the ribbon, opening their Urban Outreach Center, which, as I said before, serves tens of thousands of persons. The St. Albans Presbyterian Church in Queens noted that there was a need for seniors to have housing, knowing that we live a cycle of life where we're not always young, but we age. They bought a piece of property near the church and worked with a developer to put up affordable senior housing, which you can see in this slide today. Likewise, the First Jamaica Presbyterian Church, Queens, had a parking lot, and after surveying the community for what are the needs of the community, they decided that also affordable housing was a pressing need in their neighborhood. They gave up their parking lot and, working with a partner in a partnership relationship, have now built over 170 units of affordable housing, on which the first floor will also become a place for a community health center for the neighborhood. Sometimes churches don't always make it. Sometimes they close. Sometimes buildings become in disrepair, as the Home Street Church did in the Bronx. However, property and churches can still leave legacies in the communities in which they live. So this Bronx Presbyterian Church, working with Bronx Pro developers, built more than 60 units of low-income senior housing, including many units that are sustainable or supportive housing for seniors who had previously been homeless. They have a number of social workers also engaged in that place. This particular building, you may not know, won an architectural award just last year. Sometimes when churches close, they give birth to a new church. The Prospect Heights Presbyterian Church left as its legacy a building in which a new worshiping community started by and for the incarcerated has now moved into this building, known now as the Church of the Gethsemane, which also houses a Jewish synagogue. In this building, people send cards and visit those who are incarcerated, as well as gather those who are formerly incarcerated together as they re-enter society and help them with that re-entry. Maybe not all buildings need to be rebuilt, but one church in Harlem, the Rendell Memorial Presbyterian Church, decided that it's needed to address the amount of homelessness that it found in its neighborhood, using its former fellowship hall now as a 7-day-a-week place where those who have no housing can find housing. This very church also established a pilot program with the Department of Homeless Services in New York City, which helps to provide financial support for this very program to go 7 days a week. When you can't do much with your building, perhaps, or don't have the means, you can always be advocates for things like affordable housing in New York City, and gather with others who also want to advocate for meeting needs in New York, whether they be housing or those who are food insecure having food, or those who maybe are just looking for artistic expression, you can be advocates. Let me say in closing, the corona pandemic can also be seen as a portal for us as Presbyterian congregations to decide how and whether through individual or collaborative relationships, we can utilize our buildings and property so that they are places that not only welcome persons, but make room for them. We might have to repurpose our buildings for multiple uses, making room for them to be more relevant to our mission and to the real needs of the neighbors that have grown dire in this pandemic and in our neighborhoods. So the goal of today's presentation is to help churches know what their options are and what missional pre-development and planning needs to happen first to make room for repurposing your property for community engagement. I thank you for being part of this, and may God so encourage you and your congregation. Thank you.
Well, as Bob has suggested in his remarks, many congregations find that they're faced with challenges in their property because the cost of maintaining that property is ever rising, and oftentimes the amount of revenue available to support those facilities tends to be shrinking. But it's important to realize that church's property, while it's often its most expensive liability, is also its most valuable asset. The challenges we face is to make the best use of that valuable asset. What we can do is to maintain and maximize the use of that with the goal of being good stewards of this property in the furtherance of congregational mission. The opportunities that we face fall into two general categories. You can use your property to endow your future or in meeting community needs. First, in talking about endowing your future, this is best approach for smaller properties such as a manse or other underutilized property that may have limited development potential. It can provide financial resources for the maintenance of worship space, for repurposing other useful space of the church, or endowing the building's programs and mission. Meeting community needs is an opportunity to partner with a developer on a project to specifically address the needs of the community that you are committed to serve. This is best for properties with greater development potential and has an opportunity for larger projects. Endowing your future requires monetizing physical assets, or it's an opportunity to do so, but in assessing the opportunities, you must first look at how your property is used today. Have you done an appraisal? What are the land use restrictions on that space? The financial stability of your organization is also something of strong consideration. And perhaps most importantly is the leadership team. This is an important consideration because the scope of projects that you can take on is only within the realm of what your leadership team can handle. These projects often take many years to execute, and as a consequence, that team needs to be committed over the long term to do some of the more aggressive projects. Finally, the goal of this is mission consistency. What are the long-term goals and objectives of your congregation? Before taking on any project, this is an important question that needs to be answered. In meeting community needs, the primary focus of this webinar is really heavily dependent upon community engagement. What are the most critical needs within your community? How do you partner with those faith-based, with what other faith-based community and activist groups are doing in the community? What is the congregation's past and current connection to the community, and what are the capabilities of the church's leadership team. There are advantages to taking this approach, even though it's a more aggressive approach, because there's the opportunity to make a significant impact on the community in a way that wouldn't be available to the church without this major commitment. But it requires active engagement in project design and ongoing operations. However, it's important to realize that the requirements of projects like this involve significant technical and management expertise at the congregational level. As a consequence, there's often a high degree of risk with these projects, and projects can take years and often require community and government approvals. The most important issue here, I think, is to understand the need for leadership at the congregational level. Even with projects where a development team can be brought on board with competent attorneys, developers, finance, and planners, there is still the important leadership role for the congregation itself. And more than anything else, this needs to drive your decision about what sorts of projects are appropriate for your congregation. So in summary, no matter what path you follow, planning is critical. Understanding the capabilities of your congregation is essential. The leadership team that would move this project forward is paramount to the success, and understanding the level of commitment that's required, even though the opportunities for success can be significant, it's important to understand that these projects can take an enormous amount of time to actually execute and bring to the fruition. Nat Christensen will talk about the steps involved in bringing your team together to make sure that you can be successful in your projects.
Thank you, Roger and Bob. As we begin, before we begin, I'd just like to tell a little bit of a story I'd once heard that a generation or so before our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was born, the scholar Hillel was approached by a young man who was frustrated by all the rules and regulations in the Torah that he had to remember. And so he approached the rabbinical scholar and asked him and challenged him to state all of the law standing on one foot. So Hillel lifted one foot and said, "Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself." Hillel put his foot down, then said, "The rest is commentary. Now go study." So as we deal with the issue of engagement, taking all of the interests of your stakeholders into account, aligning those interests with the church and its mission and its project, that is the key thing. Everything else is basically commentary. When we align the interests of the congregation and the session, the local church, the broader church, i.e. the Presbytery, when necessary, depending upon the project, the community, and then also keeping those interests aligned with the developers and attorneys and city agencies that may be part of the process, doing that is key to making sure that the process is going to be smooth and without unnecessary entanglements and delays. So let's look at the polity and the practical. So my presentation will basically divide it up into those two parts. So let's take a look at the polity first. Our book of order in G-1.0101 states that the congregation is the church engaged in the mission of God in its particular context. The triune God gives the congregation all the gifts of the gospel necessary to being the church, and the congregation is the basic form of the church, but it is not of itself a sufficient form of the church. Thus, congregations are bound in communion with one another, united in relationships of accountability and responsibility, contributing their strength to the benefit of the whole, and are called collectively the church. In other words, ours is a polity that recognizes both the particularity of each individual local church, as well as the organic unity of the broader church, which is the body of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It is in this uniplural context that gave rise to practical applications such as the trust clause, which states that each individual congregation holds, manages, and even develops its property in trust for the benefit of the whole. And this is, in essence, an extension of the organic unity of the church, for we are collectively stronger, collectively wiser, collectively richer, and collectively more able to be the ambassadors of Christ than we are individually. And in light of such, please allow me to remind you of the processes that we collectively adopted in our presbytery to assist individual churches that seek to repurpose or reposition any of their real property. So first and foremost, it is necessary for any such church to review or to update its mission, to ascertain exactly where any project falls within the goals that the church has for itself and its ministry. This review also should be shared with the appropriate committees and commissions of the presbytery. The internal and external examination is a prerequisite of the Board of Trustees to consider approval of any such project. In addition, the Board of Trustees recently set forth other needed approvals. And although the language set forth in our December 2020 report speaks of sales of property, the same set of approvals would be needed for any repurposing or repositioning of a church's real property. In its December 2020 recent report to the Presbytery, the Commission on Mission, Budget, and Corporate Responsibility reminded the Presbytery that, and I quote, "A congregation shall not mortgage or otherwise encumber any of its real property, and it shall not acquire any real property subject to an encumbrance without the written permission of the presbytery transmitted to the session of the congregation, as set forth in Book of Orders, Section G-4.0206A. Board of Trustees should be consulted if a congregation is considering any sale, purchase, lease, or construction related to such congregation's property. And any sale of church property, including but not limited to the church's manse, cannot be effected without the following steps being taken. A, the church's trustees, if any, must approve the sale. B, the church's session must approve the sale. C, the church's congregation must approve the sale. D, the Board of Trustees must see written evidence of steps A, B, and C, and must review the contract of sale. If and as and when the Board of Trustees issues with the sale are resolved to their satisfaction, the Board of Trustees would recommend to the presbytery the approval of the sale. E, the Board of Trustees or the presbytery must approve the sale. And then F, the New York Supreme Court must see written evidence of step E, and then the New York State Supreme Court must approve the sale. Well, what does all that mean practically? Well, in the first instance, it means that the local church should identify amongst its members those that can lead the church in any such project. And those chosen may or may not be members of the session, but they need to have very strong organizational, communication, and business-related skills, as well as the time to commit to managing an undertaking that will take years to complete in terms of construction, and maybe even more years in terms of managing. So I can't emphasize that enough, because the ability to manage the process and keep all parties well informed of progress throughout the process is very key. The leadership must be able to manage the issues and to keep information flowing between attorneys, developers, the congregation, and the Board of Trustees. And the Board of Trustees should be informed of the church's plans as soon as practicable when they are formulated. Presumably, this would be after the church's mission review that it undertakes, which review results in a determination by the local church that repurposing at least some of its real property is essential to that mission. And as the church confers with the Committee on Congregational Ministry and Nurture and the Commission on Ministry of the Presbytery regarding its mission, the Board of Trustees should be made aware of its general development plans. And as the church chooses its attorney advisors and its developers and the agency advisors and so forth, the trustees may be able to be a resource of information and even potential third-party advisors, because the trustees bring individual and collective experience to the table, and we are always willing to help. In addition, by being transparent with the Board of Trustees sooner than later, the approval process outlined above would be greatly facilitated and policy-related delays would be minimized. And so with respect to dealing with attorneys and developers and outside parties, always make sure that you are dealing with and that they are dealing and working for you and not working for one another. So for instance, make sure that attorneys have no connection with the developers and vice versa, so that they're working for you and not for one another. And it's important that your highest and best good in any proposed transaction is also theirs. There should always be an alignment of interests. And as there is and should always be between the individual church and the broader church and organic unity, so should there always be a transactional unity between the church and its advisors. So in summary, choose strong leadership, because the leadership chosen will determine the ultimate trajectory of the transaction. The mission review, of course, is vital, and doing so will help the church to formulate what is its highest and best use of its resources, including its real property. Making sure that you obtain the necessary approvals and keeping all the necessary constituents informed will definitely ease that process. And in the management of outside advisors, make sure that their interests are aligned with the church's interests at all times. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathaniel. Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Robert. To our attendees, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to us in the chat, drop them in the Q&A box, and our speakers or panelists will be more than happy to answer. We have one person who has raised their hand. So Mr. Reyes, please go ahead. You are get the opportunity to speak. I do believe you're muted. So we do have one question. This question is, are trustees available to help in the evaluation process?
The answer to that is absolutely yes.
And this is a question from Mr. Quarter. We have another question, says, can you elaborate on why the endowment approach is best for smaller transactions? Roger, you're still muted.
The endowment approach is often best when there is not the talent and resources within the congregation to take on a more comprehensive project. Selling a piece of property, such as a manse that may have limited development potential or some other piece of surplus property, can provide funding that can be used to improve the congregation or worship space, to repurpose space for other community use and so on, or to provide ongoing funding for projects and community programs. So there's more than one way to skin the cat here. One is active engagement on a specific program going forward. The other is to set aside funds that can be used for a range of other programs. The endowment approach is simpler from the standpoint of the amount of talent, expertise, and leadership you need at the community level, and more flexible in terms of how those proceeds can be used for mission. If you don't have a piece of property available that has significant development potential, this may be the only approach that's available to you.
Thank you. So there's one other question that is, can any of the panelists provide names of developers that can help a congregation determine a feasibility project? And that's an apt question that I feel that the speakers in the next portion of this webinar might also be able to shed some light on. So we will hold that one for a little bit.
I will concur with you, Rhonda. We will get to that. Thank you.
And I believe that's all the questions that we have right now. So Kate, feel free to introduce our next speakers.
Great, thank you so much, Rhonda, and everyone for your questions. The second section is an overview of the work of the Partnership for Faith-Based Affordable Housing and Community Development. Reverend Peter Cook serves as Executive Director of the New York State Council of Churches, which represents 7,000 congregations across the state of New York. In his pastoral roles, he has been a strong advocate for the development of affordable housing. He currently serves as Vice President of the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative and is directing the Council's Who is My Neighbor Community Development Initiative to help faith institutions use their property to better serve their town. Mark Ringberg is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing. Since the Assembly's establishment in 1985, Mark has been addressing homelessness through advocating public policy solutions and other strategies in partnership with an ever-broadening network of faith communities, other advocates, housing and service providers, elected officials, and those who have experienced homelessness. Take it away.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everyone. First, let me say how pleased I am to be with all of you, and I will be presenting a little more information about the partnership a little later in my remarks, but I want to begin just looking at why we're here and the great need that we are here talking about addressing. So some of these statistics may be familiar with many of you, but just to make them clear, we now have around 60,000 homeless individuals in New York City, probably over 85,000 in New York State. There are also, of the 1 million rent stabilized apartments in New York with 2.5 million renters, about 44% of the households are rent burdened, meaning they're paying over 30% of their income in rent. And 25% of those households, maybe 250,000 households, are severely rent burdened, meaning that they're paying more than 50% of their income in rent, which means that these folks are very, very close to becoming homeless themselves. In addition to that, of those 60,000 homeless individuals, those are their families, are often costing us $8,000 a month or more to keep them in a hotel. And for individuals, our cost is about $35,000 a year to keep them in a shelter. And as I like to say, keeping people in shelters rather than homes is like keeping them on their knees instead of helping them get back on their feet. And we're here to help people get back on their feet. Now, why are we here today? Why are we talking to congregations about this? Because the potential for congregations to create affordable housing is tremendous. A study in Brooklyn by the Director of Land Use determined that 26,000 units of housing could be produced on faith property in Brooklyn alone without removing or modifying any of the existing buildings. So we have a tremendous capacity to do good. Also, developing affordable housing on faith property not only serves the community, but it can help stabilize congregations. Now, we had a meeting with folks at HPD a number of years ago, and it became very clear to us that in terms of developing affordable housing, two crucial early elements are property and support for pre-development. Property is what the faith community can bring to the table. Pre-development expertise and resources is not often what the faith community can bring to the table. But we have an opportunity by exploring the possibility of developing affordable housing on faith property to stabilize our congregations, to find new ways of living out the church's mission in response to and as part of the evolving neighborhood. So affordable housing is clearly a challenge, but as we see, it is greatly needed and worth the effort. Now, even under the optimum circumstances, building affordable housing is a considerable challenge in New York City, New York State. And a particular part of the challenge is that, as we know, building market rate housing is much more profitable in the narrow sense. It is not profitable in the broader sense of serving those most in need. But to benefit the community, it's important that the congregation is very clear and consistent with its values, but also with its potential. To make housing viable presents key challenges, which is why it's important that all possible means are brought to this effort to see if affordable housing can be done. And as we say, it's said that God doesn't make any more property. God is making property, but much slower than our time frame. So, but we do have property that God has given us, and I think we're required to use that to God's benefit and to the benefit of God's people. But to have the best chance of building affordable housing, we have to be very clear about our mission and very clear about the options we have to maximize our property, sustain our ministry, and to work with our community. Now, a key factor in a successful effort to build affordable housing is consistent leadership. The fact is that housing projects can take years. And so if you're starting a project and you're in transition, you're already faced with a challenge. But in addition to consistent and strong leadership, the project that is undertaken must be consistent with the church's mission, must be clear, but also must be broadly supported by the membership and must engage the presbytery in very early stages in an ongoing way. And, as I say, involving the community, there may be certain needs that the church members are aware of, but unless you really engage the community and determine what the needs are of your neighbors and of the city, you will likely not be nearly as successful as you need to be in engaging those potential partners who will be needed to bring the project to a successful conclusion. Now let me take a moment to introduce the Partnership for Faith-Based Affordable and Housing and Community Development. So the partnership is made up of 4 entities. The Interfaith Assembly on Homelessness and Housing, which I'm the director of, and we've been around about 35 years. New York State Council of Churches, which Peter Cook, who will speak right after me, is the director of, which has been around since the late 1800s. And Bricks and Mortals, which Kate is the director of, which has been around 4 years in process. And the Interfaith Affordable Housing Collaborative, which was established about 3 years ago. But as an entity, we are only about 6 months old. So though many of our partners have been doing this work for many decades, the partnership itself is new. And we are in the process of learning how to be most effective. And on behalf of the members of the partnership, I want to say how pleased we are to be working with the Presbyterian of New York City in doing what we consider holy work. So the partnership was established to assist congregations with evaluating their property and mission and connecting them with the expertise and resources to help them to develop affordable housing. As I mentioned before, key components, necessary but not sufficient components in developing affordable housing is one, having property, and two, having the early resources to help determine what is possible to do with your property. And this is why the partnership was established, because many congregations with property don't have that expertise or don't have the resources needed to develop the expertise, to develop the plan. Obviously, it's very hard to, as the man at HPD said to me, it's easier for us to find the $10 million to develop housing than it is to find the $25,000 or $50,000 to figure out what housing you want to develop. So that key element, that gap funding, that helping to figure out what it is you want to do, is the gap that the partnership looks to fill. Now, Peter will be going over in a moment the processes that we have developed in working with congregations to help you determine how to move forward. But let me say that it is possible that in looking at the options, the congregation will determine that affordable housing is not the best use of its property, and that's fine. We want to help. In effect, we want to be sure that no congregation makes a bad decision with regard to its property. We see our clients, in effect, as the congregation and the people in the city in need of affordable housing. That's who we serve. The partnership does not charge for our services. And the partnership is also engaged in looking to find other resources within the faith community and within the housing development professional community in general to bring more resources to the table to assist congregations to get to the point where they can decide to build affordable housing or decide to do something else with their property. Now, also, let me say, as Bob mentioned earlier, not everyone is in a position to develop affordable housing, but everyone is in a position to promote policies that will develop affordable housing. So Peter Cook and I, particularly, and the rest of the partnership, will work to identify policies that we feel will serve the needs of those who need affordable housing, those who are homeless, those at risk of homelessness, and we will promote those policies to our partners. And certainly the partnership will do that with the Presbytery, as we do, and with every other group we work with. But in addition to that, we're also in conversation with elected and public officials to take a look at what policies are missing at the city and state level, and to try to see if that those policies can be modified to make development of affordable housing on faith property easier. Now, the fact is, this is not an easy thing to do. We're looking to make it easier by bringing all the stakeholders together. And we look to you, those who are with us today, and the rest of our partners with it, among the faith community and within the housing development community to help make this easier. The fact is, we have a tremendous need for affordable housing. The faith community has a tremendous capacity to be part of that solution. And we're here to see to it that we maximize that capacity to serve God's people. There's no reason that homelessness needs to exist except as a result of a crisis. 60,000 homeless people in New York City is unacceptable. And as a community of faith, we can do something about that. And I'm really happy that you've joined us so we can talk about how we can do that. And now I'm going to introduce my colleague, Peter Cook, who will walk us through some of the nuts and bolts of how the partnership is proposing to do that. And let me say, again, this is a work in progress. We are looking to learn from our time with you today, and we welcome your suggestions and your resources and your engagement. So thank you very much. I think, Peter, you're on.
Thanks, Mark. Mark's really been a leader in the city of New York for many years to advocate for homeless people, and it's great to work with him in partnership. I am Peter Cook. I'm the executive director of the New York State Council of Churches, which, as Mark said, has been around since the late 19th century, and we're really pleased to work with our partners in the Presbyterian Church who have been with us from the very beginning. And this whole process might well relate to the missional work of Presbyterian Church around Matthew 25, which focuses on addressing poverty, racism, and congregational revitalization. So we'll hope that what we offer here is consistent with the Presbyterians and seeking to be a Matthew 25 church. One other thing, I'd just say that as a pastor in my first church, I showed up with a property that was $450,000 in debt and a work site which had been abandoned by the developer in a half-built sanctuary. By the end of my ministry there, we had managed to figure out how to build a 22-unit affordable housing development. So I'm just here to say that this is very possible, but you need to be very tenacious in your leadership as you seek to develop your property. Really 5 phases that we look at as part of our pre-development process. The first is that we really urge a church to form a team of leaders. It includes the pastor or another point person and 3 or 4 lay leaders who are really committed to seeing the process through. It takes a lot of time and tenacity. It also takes leadership that is very aware of the congregational and presbytery processes and is committed, as Nathaniel said, to keeping everybody informed. Part of what that team will do is fill out a pre-development survey, which the partnership has prepared, and that will help you in assessing your church's congregation's mission, encouraging you to talk with your community and assess your property. And it's at this phase very early on that it would really be a good time to start a conversation with the trustees of the presbytery. At the end of phase 1, a decision is made as to whether the congregation, in consultation with the trustees, is ready to draft a scope or a mini grant proposal, if you will, to get pre-development money and or services to help the congregation gather more information about their property that they will eventually need to prepare a request for proposals or a request for qualifications. If a congregation has not reached out to the presbytery at this point, they really must do so. But again, we urge consultation with the trustees at the very beginning before you move on to phase 2. In the second phase, the session or its appointed team prepares a scope of work. It's a mini grant proposal to secure funds to perform that work. The scope should be designed in consultation with a land use attorney. Most churches have an attorney draft a scope for congregational approval. Those funds and/or in-kind expertise can come from a variety of places, including your congregation, your denomination, the funds provided to us by Trinity Church Wall Street, enterprise community partners, and other entities. And once the scope of work secures funding with the review of the Presbytery's trustees, the work of gathering that information begins. And that information gathering would include, but not be limited to, an updated appraisal, which includes assessment of the property based on property uses, an in-depth zoning study, facilitated conversations with neighbors and officials, an architectural massing study, title search and legal analysis of the property, an environmental analysis, and a real clearly laid out process to ensure that decision-making is clear and it's mission consistent. Once that information's assembled, the attorney and others will meet with the leadership team and representatives of the Presbytery to evaluate that information and then decide whether the congregation is ready to move to phase 3, which is to write a request for proposals or a request for qualifications. It's really, really important during phase 2 that a potential developer does not pay for the congregation's attorney, experts, and representation. The church should never, ever sign an agreement of any kind with a developer until they have completed phase 2 and also phase 3, where they assemble the information into an RFP or RFQ with the approval of the Presbytery's trustees. In phase 3, the congregational team, in collaboration with the trustees and the attorney, assembles the information they've gathered to prepare a request for proposals. This is a fully baked proposal on which potential developers can bid, or to prepare a request for qualifications where the congregational team engages a developer a little sooner to ask them to assume more pre-development costs, but agrees to afford both parties the decision about whether they'll enter into a binding contract. In phase 4, the session and congregation, in conjunction with the Presbytery and with the help of their attorney, solicits bids from developers and negotiates a development agreement after preparing an RFQ or RFP. And finally, the congregation in phase 5 and the developer proceed together to secure financing for the project, establish site control, prepare designs, and enter into the development process. So if I could just make 5 quick observations based on what we have learned. Number 1, churches without a lot of money can often be excellent candidates for development if they have significant land or a building asset. Just because your church might have more resources than a poorer church does not necessarily mean that a wealthier church is in a better position to develop its property. It's much more about what you can do with your property and your leadership and not so much about what you have in your bank account. Second, you really need to gather a small team with clear authorization from a decision-making body, the session in your church and the presbytery, to manage the development process. Please understand your church's bylaws, what's in the Presbyterian Book of Order, and follow them. And really be transparent in your decision-making and do not rush the process. This will help avoid leaders or people who might try to abuse the process. If you're clear and transparent, it's much harder for leaders who don't have the best interests of the church to operate. Don't sign anything, 3, with a developer until you have an attorney which represents you and the approval of the presbytery's trustees, and only when you and the church are ready to prepare an RFP and RFQ should you start talking with the developers. So somebody had asked about how to engage developers or what list of developers might be there. There are developers out there who are excellent. There are some who are not so excellent, but even the excellent ones are really not very effective unless you've done this preparatory work. You really need to understand your interests first. Number 4, do pay attention to your mission. Remember that your church's members are not just is in your building, but really your members in the best sense are the people in your neighborhood and community who need to be served. And so we really need you to think about how you are serving your community, and that should be a central question for your mission as a church. And finally, we urge churches not to be fortresses and instead not be afraid of their neighbors and city officials. Instead, talk to them, go out and listen to them, even use some of your pre-development dollars to help you have a structured neighborhood inquiry so that you're sure that your development is mission consistent. Thanks.
If there, excuse me, if there are any questions for Mark or for Peter, please drop them in the Q&A or send them along in the chat. Someone has asked, any input on roles of community boards?
The role of community boards, you said?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that part of your pre-development process is really getting clear about who you need to consult early on in the process, and that probably includes a community board. I think that each congregation might have a unique mix of city bodies that they need to consult with based on what they're seeking to do with the property. Some of those consultations are in common and some might be a little different, but I think Jessica in the next round is going to talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, I'm just seeing, and what about the borough president and landmarks commission? Yeah, that's part of it too. But again, having a clear-eyed sense of who to consult with when based on your property is really important. Like, is your property landmarked or not, for instance?
I see a question from Dave Mammon about the partnership and how it was established and how it works. And let me just take that a bit. As I said, the partnership developed as a result of a conversation with Trinity Church when we said this is what we'd like to do, and they said we'd love to support you. We'd like to support you as a group. So then, those of us that were working together informally decided we would formalize our arrangement and received a grant from Trinity Church, and we now have $86,000 in our pre-development fund, and we're working with other entities that have another few $100,000 in their fund, as well as a lot of technical assistance. So it was established specifically for the purpose of providing pre-development support for congregations in the interest of developing affordable housing. It is an ongoing process. As we said, we're talking with folks from the UCC fund, from the United Methodist Church City Society, from other groups, to really pool our resources and pool our information to make sure that, in effect, no church property is poorly used, and that every property that could be used for affordable housing is used that way. So this is why we were established, and again, it's an ongoing process. We're very excited to be working with the Presbyterian. Let me say that Bob has been part of our effort for a number of years, been a great partner, and it's terrific that we're doing this with the Presbyterian. We plan to do this with other denominations as well as other faith groups.
And can I just say that the reason we got into this whole thing is because we wanted to avoid having churches get into development deals because they were desperate or because they couldn't afford to do their pre-development work. And so ended up having developers paying for things that too soon, which bound the church's interests. So our goal is to provide pre-development money and resources so the church can do an unencumbered inquiry and be an informed consumer when they get into a development agreement. So we try to work collaboratively with other funding sources to be sure churches get that unencumbered assistance.
Thank you, Peter. I think we have one additional comment. Oh, someone was just saying that it's great advice. So we do have one question here, and it is on how to determine the rental rates for a organization that's using your property. So I would just like to, if you guys would like to talk about how one might engage experts around something like that, a land use expert, a real estate expert. But I also know that this person, I know you submitted this question quite a while ago, to let you know that our panelists who are coming up next will be very able to answer that question for you.
So do you want us to answer that specifically now, Rhonda, or you want us?
If you'd like to answer it now, Jason, that's fine.
Sure. So I think that you're asking the question, what will the market bear? But before we get there, right, I think the entire, if you want to call it thesis or philosophy of this presentation is how to balance income with your church's and community's needs, and that only you can decide that. So the short answer is you can charge whatever you think is appropriate. So there's frequently sliding scales based on the size of the organization, what they're able to pay. It could be open book process, etc. That can be complicated, and so that depends on a lot of things. If you want to know essentially what the market will value, really you could get an appraisal, but you would have to pay for that, and it's probably overkill. Most brokers will provide you what is called an opinion of value, and they will essentially tell you what the range is of rents for properties similar to yours, price per square foot. And then you can use that at least as a starting point. Brokers typically do that because they want your business, and then if you use a broker, you get they are paid a commission, a percentage based on the rent. If you have an existing tenant, I don't think that you want to pay a broker, but some brokers, particularly for a church, will provide that opinion of value just because it's something good to do and to get goodwill, and hopefully it'll lead to future value or business for them. And so we, and I think others on this call, could certainly help establish those relationships and help get an opinion of value, if that'd be helpful.
Thank you, Jason. And happily, Kate, if you could, we have no more questions. So if you could go ahead and introduce our last two panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you everyone for your questions so far. Hopefully they've all been helpful for everyone to hear. So for our last section, two very helpful attorneys with Goldstein Hall, you had a preview from one of them, the section is legal and land use considerations for development. Jason Labate is an attorney focusing on faith-based development, not-for-profit law, affordable housing, and community development. He is a frequent presenter on faith-based and nonprofit real estate issues and is co-author of Changing the Paradigm, Creating Scale, and Keeping Local Expertise in Nonprofit Affordable Housing Development, published in the Journal of Affordable Housing and Community Development Law. Jessica Loser's practice is split between land use law, zoning, faith-based development, not-for-profit law, and affordable housing financing. Jessica represents a wide range of not-for-profit, for-profit, and religious corporations through the various stages of real estate evaluation, development, adaptive reuse, or sale.
Great, thank you, Kate. And you can see from our pictures, and you'll see from, I guess when Jessica talks, Jessica has made it through COVID okay, and clearly I have changed greatly from my picture. This is post-COVID attorney. So before I forget, and before we jump into this, and I'm gonna have a pretty fast pace, and I apologize for that, but there's a lot of information I want to get to. There was a question about developers doing a feasibility study. And I don't think we particularly touch on it here. We can touch on it more in the Q&As. The point, it's been said before, and I want to say it again, the church ought to have professionals that represent just it. And even getting an exploratory massing study or potential by a developer can create some sense of obligation or expectation on either side. And so there are pre-development resources that the partnership discussed and that are available. And I think you can get what you're looking for without going through developers by having your own professional team. Okay. With that said, I wanted to start with this HALO study. So this was conducted by Partners for Sacred Places and I think the University of Pennsylvania. And I just want to reset a little bit because there's a lot of discussion about the need of churches for capital and some of, for lack of a better term, the weaknesses. And I just want to sort of reset the paradigm here and say, yeah, there are needs, but it is because frequently because churches have been providing great services for a very long time and have substantial deferred capital needs, but that they are still immense contributors to the community that can actually be quantified. And so you can see there's an example here of Judson Memorial Church, which is next to NYU. And you can see that the value to the community in an economic sense of the services that it provides, either through purchases of its patrons or the services that replace community, governmental services that would otherwise be required, is almost $10 million. And Judson has real needs. But this is critical, I think, in advocating for your church, whether you have it for your church or not. The general concept is very powerful when you're talking to stakeholders. Next, please, Rhonda. So these are our steps to maximization. I'm not going to go through them all now. They pretty much echo in a slightly different form, but really echo what has been said already by all of the previous speakers. And more detail of this is available on the New York State Council of Churches website. And so I won't go into depth here. Like I said, I really just want to give you a smattering, and for lack of a better term, start to, I guess, broaden your imagination while setting your expectations as to what this process looks like and what the possibilities are. Next slide. So here we're going to focus on steps 2 and 4, right? Gathering your documents and implementing reconnaissance, and then evaluating what your possibilities are. We're not going to do it here because we don't have a case example, but I'm going to show you what some of the techniques, strategies, and possibilities are that you want to consider. Next slide. This is just an example. What do you own, right? So this process is not going to look the same for everyone, depending on whether you're in the countryside, whether you have a landmarked property, or whether you're a corner or storefront church. Next slide. This is just an example of some of the documents that you might expect. They'll be very old. They might be very arcane and difficult to decipher for you, but the point is you should gather everything you have, and then you can walk through it with your team of professionals, because you want to err on the side of over-inclusion. And this you should do if you're considering anything with your real property. Next slide. So these are some of the questions that you should be asking. Ownership, right? I apologize for the sirens. How do you own your property, right? Do you own it directly? And so you want to see your deed. Is it in the name of your current congregation, or is it perhaps a predecessor? Is it in fact owned by the Presbyterian of New York City? We've seen that in other hierarchical churches. Or is it perhaps owned in an affiliate, a not-for-profit, secular for reasons for funding or otherwise? And then importantly, are there restrictions on your property, right? So you want ideally to have the deed for your property so you can identify whether there are deed restrictions that require the property to be used for worship exclusively or in part. And how is that going to impact what your development plans or use plans are for your property? Are you landmarked? As your property, are they landmarked or in a landmark district? Jessica will talk more about this, but there are benefits and there are burdens from landmarking. And I won't tell you which I think is greater. And then every site that Jessica will talk about has zoning and building code limitations and restrictions. Do you have a survey, and what is your zoning right is related to restrictions? And then organizationally, you really need your corporate documents. You need your certificate of incorporation, bylaws, and then you need to confirm, do your practices line up with what your documents say, and do they need to be changed? And importantly, this is a very long process, right? In the shortest term, I would guess it's probably 18 months in most cases. If you're doing a simple lease, perhaps it can be done in several months, but if you're doing development, it's going to be years. You want to make sure that your team is there and will persist. We've engaged in many projects, or at least a few projects, where the priest has left the project midway through, and that can be fatal. Next slide. I'm not going to go into depth on this, but this was discussed before, that you need approvals on any real property transaction, a sale, a mortgage, or any lease that is 5 years or exceeding 5 years. A lease that is less than 5 years statutorily, that's by New York law, does not require any approvals. Roger, Nathan, and Robert can opine on this, I think, in the Q&A. My suggestion is that you at least inform the trustees of leases that you're entering into that are less than 5 years, so you can benefit yourself of their counsel and advice. Next slide. This is just reiterating that by law, New York law, you have to go through the process that Nathan laid out, Nathaniel, excuse me, that you have to get approval by the presbytery, and then you can and have to pursue New York State Supreme Court approval. Typically, Supreme Court approval is ministerial, but they want to make sure that you've met the statutory requirements, which are that the transaction is fair, reasonable, and in the best interest of the religious corporation at the time the transaction is made, which usually requires an appraisal and evidence that you're getting fair consideration or an explanation as to why you're not getting fair consideration. For instance, if you're pursuing a missional purpose and selling to or leasing to a not-for-profit, charitable, or religious organization. And typically, if those are satisfied, then the Supreme Court will approve. Next slide. So this is I think, where everybody's interested and where the action is, right? So you need to evaluate your property, what your needs are, internal and external. And this sort of speaks, Roger spoke to this very articulately, it may not be right, earlier, which is, do you have financial needs or are your financial needs satisfied, and can you turn to church missional and community needs? And what is your appetite for risk? And so it's what you're going to do is really going to be determined by those needs and wants. And then external, and there's not enough time to talk about it here, but perhaps we'll do a 2.0 version of this. My apologies. There are resources out there for particular secular programs, but that's going to likely require a partner and land use agreements, leases or sales or joint venture agreements with those partners. In terms of value, we talked about this internally. What is it worth to you? If you use your parish hall 5 days a week, but only in the evening, well, to replace that will be costly for you. You need to make sure that that's maintained, for instance. So even if it doesn't have a high economic value, it could have a very high missional value or worship value to you. And then external things that you can do to value your property is an appraisal, which we talked about. There are listed here several different types of appraisals. A broker can provide an opinion of value, which I mentioned. And then you can do something which is called asset-based community development or asset mapping. And Partners for Sacred Places has a lot of information on this on their website, but it can be undertaken by anyone, which is really just convening the community to determine what the community needs, what it has, and how this property can fill that need. Next slide. This is just an example of who the stakeholders are that can help you support you and create opportunities. So lenders, partners, grantors, and governmental sources. Importantly, these are different from your professionals. You should have your professionals lined up as soon as possible to help you explore everything that I've laid out. Most critically, I believe in an attorney because they have a fiduciary obligation to protect you. But frequently architects, financial consultants, and construction consultants. Next slide. So here is the meat of my presentation that I'll try to get through in the next 5 minutes, which is to sort of open your mind, which is how to build or develop. And here are some legal structures that can be appropriate, that can maintain your existence on a site while pursuing mission or extracting value. And then what to build and some examples of that. Next slide. Very simply, this is how a ground lease works. A ground lease means that you retain ownership of the property, but you are leasing frequently for 99 years, the right to develop the property and to own the development on the property to a partner, right? Trinity Wall Street has done this, is the shining example of this, and they have very regular income. Although you could be paid up front or you could be paid after the fact. Thank you. So example here is the landowner has a ground lease. Next click, Rhonda. You can see the developer provides money to the landowner, and then next click, the landowner provides development rights to the developer. And then if the developer is good and you don't have the Great Recession, this happens. Next slide. Right, you have a wonderful building, which may or may not include church space, but for which you've extracted value. Next slide. A lot split is pretty straight ahead, and I'll give you an example of this in a project. But if your lot exists, if you have one lot now, subject to zoning and building restrictions, you can in fact split your lot so that you can retain a portion of it and sell a portion of it. And we've done this in several situations. Architect needs to be intimately involved in this. It does not have to be done prior to going to market. It can be done in partnership with the developer and putting the cost, go back, Rhonda, one slide. It can be done in concert with the developer. So you can see going from one lot to two, a transferred lot that is sold and then a retained lot. Next slide. A condominium, so if you sold your entire lot, this is an example from the exterior, it looks just like one building. Next slide. But you can see inside of it, and then you can, 3 clicks, Rhonda, you can see that there is 3 condominiums inside this building. And in fact, what's contemplated here is that the church is going to sell and create affordable housing into a joint venture in which it has a part. It's going to retain the church section of it, which it's deceiving. It's actually much bigger than this angle shows you for its worship and missional activities. And then there's a community facility condo, which is anticipated to be a health clinic that's income producing. And so this is a very creative strategy. Next slide. And then what to build. So are you going to renovate? Are you going to develop, repurpose? Are you going to transfer air rights? Next slide. So this is St. Anne's and the Holy Trinity, who is a client. They have a landmark church, so you can't newly develop, not that anybody would want to, and it has a benefit and burden that Jessica is going to speak to. Next slide. So they partnered with St. Anne's School, which actually was grown out of as maybe an early not-for-profit secular affiliate of St. Anne's and the Holy Trinity, but has its own existence and is really not tied together. St. Anne's School needed space, and so entered into a 4-year, 11-month, and 29-day, right? The triggered period is 5 years for needing approval. So they entered into that period of a lease with St. Anne's School, and St. Anne's agreed to renovate the office spaces and the parish hall as part of the deal. And it really was a magnificent win-win for both. Next slide. And then, of course, you may know St. Anne's Warehouse began in St. Anne and the Holy Trinity. That relationship had mixed reviews. There are 2 sides to every story, sometimes more, but that was an example of a partnership with an ARC organization that had benefits as well as drawbacks. Next slide. Those are both robust examples. The Ali Forney Center partnered with an Episcopal church in Queens to convert their basement, essentially their parish hall, into transitional housing for LGBTQ youth. And it did not take a whole lot of startup, not a whole lot of imposition, but was hugely beneficial. And the next slide, that relationship has led to, next slide, Rhonda, has led to a partnership for development. You can see on the left-hand side here, where they're actually trying to build longer-term supportive housing for LGBT youth on the adjacent site. I don't recall whether this requires a lot split. Next slide. So this is an example you can click through of a school that, this is not a religious property, but this was a landmarked property that ultimately, after 10 years of pre-development, has become affordable housing, and it leveraged low-income housing tax credits and historical tax credits to create, I believe it's something like 70 units of affordable housing and a Boys and Girls Club on the first floor. This was unused until it was renovated. The Boys and Girls Club was in a property next door. A huge win, but a hugely long timeline. And there were many sort of trade-offs to get to this point because hugely expensive. Next slide. And then this is a development of old to new. I think this is my last, and then I'm handing it over to Jessica. Sorry to cut in your time, Jessica. So this is St. Martin's, St. Stephen's St. Martin's in Brooklyn. You can see on the left-hand side of your screen, this is the lot. The church is on one side of the lot, and then they had 3 false starts in trying to construct a new sanctuary. They raised the funding themselves and prayed that the balance of the funding would materialize. Not only did it not materialize, but the general contractor left with their proceeds not having finished their work. So after many false starts, we entered into an agreement for a lot split. And then you can see here in the center picture, the church retained where the church is, its sanctuary, sold the balance of the property. Fortunately, they could not afford to have affordable housing and have funds sufficient for their sanctuary. So this is market rate housing, but they have a brand new sanctuary parish hall doing important worship and missional work, as you can see here. Next slide. And over to Jessica to walk you through zoning, landmarking, and governmental approvals and agencies.
Thank you, Jason. And good morning. I think we're still in the morning. They definitely saved the most dense piece of the presentation for last. So I hope you have a shot of coffee from your home office and we're ready to lock into zoning. I'm going to go through a couple of different concepts about zoning and land use so that as you begin to imagine what you'd like to do with your building, which is your congregational home, you can think about what is allowable based on the governing regulations. So starting with the very, very, very basics, you can see on this slide different types of zoning property lots. There are different regulations that apply depending on where your lot is located, whether you're on a corner, a mid-block, or if your lot goes all the way through. You can see in the bottom left-hand side a typical zoning schematic about what uses are allowed on a typical street. In this example, it's an R7A district, and we'll go through in a minute what that means. As Jason mentioned before, these are all of these regulations are governed by zoning lots. Each tile here, each green square is its own zoning lot. You can have tax lots that are the same boundaries as your zoning lot or separate, and we'll get into a minute how that's relevant to development. Next slide, please. So depending on which zoning district your church is located in, that will dictate how much bulk you can build on your lot. And if you think about it intrinsically, it should match what you see generally in the city. Each of these buildings here represent what you could typically build in a corresponding district number. So R for residential, R1 to R3 here on the left, you have single family or 2 to 3 family houses without much else around. And then as you get to the mid numbers, maybe you'll see some commercial on the ground floor, the R6, R7s, R8s, are low-level apartment buildings, and then all the way to the right where you have very tall buildings as you would typically find in the Upper West Side, Long Island City, downtown Brooklyn. So it's important to know what number district you're in as an indicator of how much development your zoning lot can accommodate. And equally as important as what district you're in is the ever ubiquitous FAR or FAR. Next slide, please. FAR stands for floor area ratio. It's the equation by which you can figure out how many square feet of building you can fit on your zoning lot by multiplying the size of your lot by your FAR number. So an easy way to think of this is that if you're in a district with an FAR of 1 and you have 1,000 square foot lot, you can fit a building of up to 1,000 square feet on that lot. What I like about this slide is that it shows how flexible FAR can be. There are other rules that architects have to be mindful of, but in these 3 diagrams showing 3 very different buildings, they each have the same floor area. What is different is how it's distributed on the zoning lot. The building on the left is a building that is low and spread out. It's good for houses of worship. It's a good layout for factories. And on the other side of the continuum, you have a much narrower and higher building that would probably be better suited for an apartment building. There are a lot of zoning concepts to understand, and when you're beginning the conversation about development, the term FAR is thrown around a lot in conjunction with air rights, and so I want to go through that concept next. Next slide, please. An easy way to think about air rights, and my apologies if we were in person, I have a very helpful and unique Lego presentation that I like to give, but we'll have to settle for virtual for now. Air rights are, they exist sort of hovering over buildings. They are, They are for buildings that have not been built to their full FAR potential. This is very common for a lot of different reasons. A push for maximizing a building's FAR as akin to leaving money on the table is a very modern idea. So buildings that have been built a long time ago were not necessarily pushed to the max building envelope, as it's called. And also many houses of worship were built a long time ago when their zoning in their specific area looked very different. In any case, it's easy to think of air rights as your building's development potential. So for example, if you're in a district that allows a 5,000 square foot building and your house of worship is 3,000 square feet, then you have 2,000 square feet hovering over your building. And those are your air rights. Technically, in the zoning resolution, it's referred to as unused development rights. And the law allows, with very strict guidelines, for you to sell those unused development rights. And here are the rules. It has to be to an adjacent zoning lot, and those lots have to be adjacent for at least 10 feet. And you can think of some backyards that are sort of near each other, but in a sort of awkward way. That touch has to be for a minimum of 10 feet. You can't cross zoning district boundaries, and you can't create or increase a non-compliance, either in the old building or in the receiving site. That means that any uses that are grandfathered can't transfer their grandfathered air rights to another zoning lot. And also, if the only way the new building could be developed would create a non-compliance by like covering windows or wouldn't create enough yard space, then the air rights transfer wouldn't be approved. The mechanism by which the unused development rights are transferred is called a zoning lot merger. And the agreement that dictates that zoning lot merger is called a zoning lot development agreement, or also known as a ZELDA. What the zoning resolution allows for is for these two lots who are adjacent to each other to merge into a bigger, stronger, more crowded zoning lot. So in the picture on the right, the gray building and the tan building are going to create a zoning lot merger where they each keep their original tax lots, but they are now on one zoning lot. So zoning lot A and zoning lot B now become zoning lot AB. And the floor area, the unused development rights that have not yet been built, can be distributed in any way that is complying with the other zoning regulations. So as we've mentioned before, both in my slides and in Jason's slides, if there's extra space on your lot and you divide your tax lots, and then you have one big zoning lot, you can build two buildings. And how it is distributed is not governed by law. It is governed by the private agreement called the ZELDA. And I just wanted to make sure I don't forget anything else about ZELDAs. The ZELDA is recorded against both properties, and it stipulates how many square feet are going to be transferred from lot A to lot B and how many square feet remain on each lot. ZELDA is also a place where if there are any easements that are required for either building or any property rights that exist in perpetuity as an agreement between the two property owners, that would be memorialized in the ZELDA. The zoning law creates a special opportunity for buildings that are landmarked when it comes to air rights. In most cases, as I mentioned, a building can only transfer its air rights to an adjacent neighbor. And as you can see on the building on the left, those air rights are going across the street. So a little exciting for us zoning nerds. Next slide, please. So the question is, for landmark churches, is the Landmarks Preservation Commission your friend or your foe? It's a very good question, and I think the answer depends. Next slide, please. So the opportunity to transfer air rights either across the street or across the district boundary line vastly expands the number of potential receiving sites that a landmark property can transfer its air rights to. And I want to walk you through a transfer that Jason and I were lucky enough to work on. This photo is in downtown Brooklyn. The red box is a parish in the Episcopal Diocese of Long Island, St. Luke, St. Matthew, and the blue box in sort of hovering in the ether is a development site where the air rights are going to go to. Next slide, please. This is a picture of St. Luke, St. Matthew. It's a very beautiful facade. There was a lot of deferred maintenance, and as I'm sure you can commiserate, there was also a turnover in leadership. When we talk about what's at stake, when we talk about preserving a church, it's important that we highlight not just the community aesthetic, but also the community's heart and soul. And so next slide. Next slide, please. We're going to take a look. This is the inside of St. Luke, St. Matthew, where they had set up an emergency distribution site for supplies after Superstorm Sandy. And I think that this is equally as important, what the church can offer to the greater community as what a church looks like on its exterior. Next slide, please. This is a plot plan of what the finished building will look like. It's the blue, taller building. And you can have a better sense of all of the property lots that the developer had to hoop and jump over to transfer the air rights from the church to the development site. This was achievable through a special permit, a ULURP application at city planning. It was a long process, but being able to transfer the church's air rights provided the church with an opportunity to fix its building at a scale that it wouldn't have been able to by itself, which created a more stable home for its congregation and hopefully an expansion of its programming. Next slide, please. So here we have a happy little country church. You can tell it's a country church because it's all alone. Next slide, please. You'll see how we move from a religious property in New York City and all the different agencies that have governing regulations over a church. So I wanted to go through some of the agencies that you might have heard of or might be familiar with, just to clarify what their level of jurisdiction is. This is the oath, the Office of Hearings. It is the adjudication department for the Department of Buildings. Next click, please. This is New York City Housing Preservation Development. Should you want to develop a building with affordable housing component, HPD is the agency that has created programs through which you can apply for tax breaks and oversee the entire process of developing affordable housing. Next click, please. New York City Department of City Planning. This is an opt-in agency. Only if you want to file a special permit or a rezoning or get a waiver or build a gym or a nursing home, that all happens through city planning and its sister agency, the BSA. If you don't want to do any of those activities, then you never have to worry about BSA or city planning. Next click, please. Department of Fire. In addition to the obvious, the Department of Fire is also very interested in a church's public assembly permit, points of egress. And so if you ever have a fire inspection, those are the documents that the fire department will likely be looking at. Next click, please. Department of Environmental Protection is the best city-run utility company. They have jurisdiction over water, sewer, drinking, and also electricity. If you need an environmental study on a zoning lot, or if God forbid there's a spill or a different environmental calamity, all of that cleanup will happen through the Department of Environmental Protection. Next slide, please. Department of Transportation is another agency that has jurisdiction over properties, certain aspects, but I think it really extends to the sidewalk and streets. If you have an egress or any easement over your lot from the Department of Transportation with respect to street widening, it's very common to see that on deeds on older streets. And next click. We have one more, I think. Department of Buildings, the big one. Department of Buildings is the record keeper and part inspector for all buildings in New York City. They are, if we could go back one, please. They are interested in certificate of occupancies and public assembly permits. They do a lot of investigatory work in new construction, from zoning determinations and construction plan approvals. If you get, as I mentioned earlier, if you get a violation from the Department of Buildings, it gets adjudicated through oath, or what was used to be known as ECB. And so it's important that those are connected but separate agencies. Not listed here, but I do want to touch on very quickly is number one, because it was asked before, is the community board. There's no one answer about community boards, but I would strongly suggest developing, no pun intended, a relationship with your local community board. I've seen a lot of church deals in particular become unnecessarily complicated because of a lack of clear communication with the greater community of the good work that's happening inside the church and the church's needs from the community. There are only a limited amount of transactions for which you'd be required to go to the community board, but they are an important asset and an important voice for the greater community. And a strong relationship with the community board can only be to a church's benefit. And Landmarks is not on this church because clearly that on this panel, because that church is obviously not landmarked, but I did want to spend a couple of moments talking about landmarks. Hopefully, if you are a landmark church, that you know that you're a landmark church. If you're not, you can look up your property listing on the Landmarks website. It's a very easy interactive website, and it can tell you a lot of information about your property lot if it's under Landmarks jurisdiction. The Landmarks Commission has jurisdiction over the exterior of landmark buildings and landmark buildings in landmark districts. The exterior and anything that can be seen from a public thoroughfare, which is a fancy word for sidewalk. It is unlikely, though not impossible, for an interior of a church to be landmarked. So it's usually just the exterior. Landmarking interior of a religious building bristles against church and state separation. I want to emphasize the difference between important buildings or pretty buildings or significant buildings with landmark. Landmark, and to be specific, a New York City landmark as separate from a federal registry landmark or a state registry landmark. A New York City landmark is a site that has been evaluated by the commission to be architecturally significant. In the last couple of years, the Landmarks Preservation has also begun to landmark sites of important historical events like Stonewall, but for the most part, it's an evaluation of the historical significance of the architectural features. And so while landmarking a building ensures that those historically significant features are protected, Landmarks has no jurisdiction over use or what happens in a building. Which if you look around, like in some areas, predominantly in Manhattan, you'll find a CVS or a carpet store inside a building with a beautiful colonnade detailed facade, because the outside has been landmarked, but it does not preserve what happens inside. And so to bring this all full circle, to have the beauty of the outside of your church match the inside of your church, it takes a lot of careful planning, having a lot of friends, and making use of all the resources that are available to your congregation. Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm happy. I went through a lot, so I'm happy to answer whatever's in the chat.
And I'll step in, and there's a disclaimer that applies to the legal section, and while we're waiting for questions, and everyone else can decide if it applies to them, but none of this is advice. All of this is educational. You can't hold this against us. No backsies, circle, circle, dot, dot.
So I do not see any questions in the chat. I know that Jason, you were answering them while we were presenting. So I think thank you so much for doing that. All of the questions have been answered. We have 10 minutes left in our presentation, and I will pass this over to Kate for concluding thoughts, essentially.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So as we just have a few minutes left, if any of the panelists want to offer their concluding thoughts on this or any final advice or thoughts to round this out, I would welcome that now. If we want to go in the order that you presented, starting with the presbytery, that would be wonderful. Do any of you three have any final thoughts on this? You can take it away.
This is Robert Foltz Morrison. Just want to thank all of our presenters today for the different aspects by which they talked about this. Working with our churches and working with our trustees, there's an incredible lot of detail that often isn't always known. And I appreciate this presentation because it's laid out ways to go forward and a lot of the detail that needs to be attended to well before we get into the projects that we've done. But I also want to thank Jason at the beginning because a lot of our churches do have what's called a halo effect. And this is not an attempt just to say that churches don't have value and let's just get rid of them, because we recognize if we take a church out of a community, some of the ways that it has served that community disappear. And may not be always known except through your own analysis and talking about what is our church giving the community. So there often are effects. I often have said, even going to Judson Memorial Church, I bought a slice of pizza on the way to a meeting. Well, that was an economic impact. It may look insignificant, but if I hadn't gone to that meeting at Judson, I probably wouldn't have stopped there to buy a piece of pizza. So there's many ways by which, even as volunteers, you provide incredible assets to your communities. So please recall those human assets too that you saw in the slide that was shown about what happens on the inside of St. Anne's, even during a time when we have Superstorm Sandy. It converted. And right now, there are sites that the governor's office is looking at to be sites for vaccinations. And your place may be, if it has the capacity and the quality, to be a site for vaccinations, which we greatly need. Thank you.
And Nathaniel or Roger, do you have anything else to add?
I think Bob covered it.
All right, great.
Yeah, I agree with Roger. Bob covered it very well.
All right, Peter or Mark, do you have anything to add as a next step?
Yes, as Jason was suggesting, so we invite every member, every attendee here and every member of the Presbytery to reach out to us. I think we're asking people to speak direct, to contact Rhonda directly. If you would like to continue this conversation, if you'd like to work with us and helping to explore with you what the possibilities might be for your congregation, for your property, we understand this is a long process. It starts off with a conversation. Is this something you'd like to do? And then let's help you figure out what it is you'd like to do, if it's something that's possible. We're here to help. And we know that not everyone is ready now, but to begin the conversation to see when you might be ready and what you might be ready for, this is something we all need to do. As we said, this can help stabilize a congregation, help serve tremendous needs in the neighborhood, and really benefit the congregation and the community. Because I like to think that the people who helped create your church may be gone, but their values, their mission, their heart and soul and blood is in your property, is in your congregation. Let's try to live out their lives and their objectives in the work we do now. I think we have a tremendous opportunity, and obviously there's tremendous need. So Rhonda just put her email in the chat. If you're interested in continuing this conversation, please let us know, and let's see where we can go with it.
And did you have anything to add, Peter?
Yeah, just to build on what Mark said, when you reach out to us, the partnership, to start talking about your property, we probably would want to pretty quickly engage the Board of Trustees in the process and work closely in concert with them. We can provide technical assistance. We have a pre-development survey, and we can reason with you about what resources you might need to work through the phases. So our desire here is not to supplant what the Board of Trustees are doing, the Presbyterian Church, but to complement that effort. And the second thing I just wanted to say, because there was a question about whether, sort of the face stance of the law firm, or for that matter, anybody.
I enjoy a little square root dancing now and then.
Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. Siri did something weird. That just be leery of any developer or any entity that tries to show off their religious credentials as a way to appeal to you. And really what you need to know from a developer, regardless of their faith stance, is whether they're interested in listening to you and your mission and not pressuring you into some kind of an arrangement. And then finally, it just really helps if your church is clear about what your mission is. That will be position you to be much more able to work with experts, regardless of whether they have a faith stance. It's really about the ethics that they show in helping you to advance your mission.
Great. And 10 seconds for Jason and Jessica if you want to add anything, either or both of you.
It's never too early to start, right? And it is frequently too late. We've seen lots of churches and sanctuaries decide last minute that they need help and they need to do something with their property and not have many options. So I encourage you all to reach out to the resources that have been provided today.
Thanks. Jessica?
Yeah, I would just, the last 30 seconds, add that there's a lot of free information out there, particularly with zoning and development programs available through HPD. There's a lot of useful information on all of the city government, city agencies websites that I had mentioned earlier, city planning, landmarks, HPD, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask as many questions as you can to as many elected officials and other leaders in your community to help guide the conversation.
Fantastic. As we mentioned, we'll be sending out this whole presentation, and Rhonda just dropped all her emails in the chat, and our contact information is also in the presentation too. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you all found it very useful. Please be in contact with any members of the partnership or the presbytery to continue the conversation and discuss next steps. And if you have any follow-up questions, thank you again for joining us and stay safe.